Okay, welcome everybody. My name is Rich Lee. I'm the Executive Director of the Jandoli Institute, and this is Media Studies Across Disciplines, which let me just say a few words about what that is. On the Jandoli Institute website, we are posting 8 research papers this summer, 1 per week, and they are what the title says. They're written mostly by people who work outside of the fields of journalism communication, kind of connecting what they do with our field. And we're unveiling them 1 week at a time, but I've had an opportunity to read them all, and I'm really pleased with what we got because as a journalist, as someone who teaches journalism, it's interesting for me to see what people from other fields pick up on in our field. And through discussions like this, hopefully, more people will understand what the world of journalism is like. And our paper tonight fits right into that. It's by Connie Perkins, who's the founding director of our RN to BS nursing program. She's written a paper called Headlines Should Help, Not Harm. She's going to explain what that means in a few minutes. I also wanted to introduce 3 people who are going to serve on a panel. We're going to have a discussion after Connie presents her paper. That's Charlie Specht, who is the chief investigative reporter for WKBW-TV. Also one of our graduates, and if you live in Western New York, you know Charlie's been doing some great reporting, award-winning reporting, so we're happy to have him here today. And I'm also very happy to have 2 of my colleagues from the Jandoli School of Communication with me. That's Dr. Pauline Hoffmann and Dr. Denny Wilkins. So I want to thank Connie, I want to thank the panel. I also want to thank the folks who are listening or logged in now, or maybe folks who are watching it on recording for joining us. And I do have to thank the Leo F. Keenan Jr. Faculty Development Endowment and the Jandoli School of Communications for financing this project, for making it possible to get these 8 essays up on the website and to conduct these things. Just before I turn it over to Connie, a few little housekeeping chores. First is, if you're attending and you have a question, use the chat feature. I think this is set up so that everyone is automatically muted. I can unmute you. But I think the chat feature will probably work best. But what we're going to do, Connie's going to spend a little time talking about her paper, explaining it to us. If you haven't read it, it's on our website, jandoli.net. You can take a look there. The paper is there. And then we're going to have a Q&A session with our panel, and we'll also open it up to questions from everybody else who's online. So I think with that, Connie, again, thanks for doing this paper for us, and I'll turn things over to you.
Sure. Thanks, Rich. I'm going to share my screen.
Yep.
So, was said, I want to say thank you to the Jandoli Institute and Rich for this opportunity to share something in a different form of advocacy for our profession. So the inspiration behind Headlines Should Help, Not Harm, I thought would be important to start with. So, of course, as you know, I'm a registered nurse, and what you may not know is that my husband is also a registered nurse. And I shared this picture here because through our careers together, we've always been local. We actually served as back-to-back house supervisors at Cole Memorial, which is now UPMC Cole in Coudersport, Pennsylvania. So being the day shift supervisor and being followed by your husband as the night shift supervisor gives you a little bit more effort and energy to get the job done and get the holes filled in the schedule if that was a problem. So we learned a lot during our careers together. And certainly that was part of the inspiration for putting the time into this article, because we do have a passion for rural healthcare and our profession as nurses. And we often talk about what happens in the news from the perspective of nursing is common in our household because of what we do. I'm also the founding director of nursing at St. Bonaventure, so that is certainly an important piece of how I view the news and my normal routine. So the inspiration of this article also I have to share with my faculty team, both Erin, Suzanne, and myself, all 3 of us, I suppose. We make up the nursing department at St. Bonaventure, and that's part of our discussions. Did you see what happened in the news? what's going on in our profession. We look at the news from a slightly different lens, if you will, because of what we do and who we are. And one of the stories that was shared that we had talked about early on in thinking about this article was one of a nurse practitioner that had left her child in a hot car, and that child had passed away from heat stroke. And not only did that affect us because we all are mothers, but it didn't just end there. The story stuck with us for a lot of reasons, but what followed after that incident in this poor mother's life was an outcry and a rage, if you will, from the public, several comments saying that this nurse practitioner shouldn't be allowed to practice because of her mistake while outside of work. And we saw it on the local news, on national news, over and over again coming up. People outside of the courtroom so upset with it still. And it was another reminder that when you are in a profession that is looked to at the public, that they run in tandem, you're in work and out of work. So that was really got me thinking about how headlines are used, and maybe that's not something that's being thought of in the world of journalism. Using a profession might be an easy way to identify somebody in headlines, but what does it do to the overall profession? Is it truly helpful? Is it truly necessary in the article? So a common practice to becoming a licensed healthcare professional is taking an oath to do no harm. And I thought that would be an interesting solution to using headlines, throwing professions into headlines, if we shared that professional tradition with other disciplines, had them consider taking some sort of oath and using that to reflect on to make sure they're doing what they signed up to do, which is what we do in health professions. So then, the idea of headlines are important because they are a reader's first step on the journey to getting information. And I think that is really important to remember, is that this is where people get information to. It's not just the entire article. It's not just the platform, but it could just be the headline. It's often thought to need to draw people in enough that they would either take the deep dive and read, or swipe left and move on to the next thing. But really, something that I experience every day, and I think a lot of readers do, is that we're bombarded with information wielding headlines from all angles. My phone runs my life. It's with me everywhere. I get apps that are pre-programmed automatically to scroll across the screen. There are email blogs that come to my email. Just today alone, I got one from Medscape that had 6 headlines. I had to choose I read the 6 headlines, and I could choose to click and read more, or move on, or archive it for later. I wasn't looking for information, it came to me, electronic and print journals, newspapers, streaming services, satellite radio, just to name some of them. Given this constant access to information, it's harder to be uninformed than misinformed. And you can see some statistics here. I'm certainly not any different than the average American, I suppose. I am, seeing headlines all the time. I'm definitely in the category of several times, because that's just one email that I got today. But even as I digest a journal, when I set aside the time to read, my latest American Nurse Today, journal or something, I'm looking at the headlines and making that decision. And sometimes that's where I gain my information, and I move forward and not read any further. But then if that information comes up later, I'm still thinking back to the headline. I still retained that information. So it's definitely, headlines have a lot of things going on. For 18 years in a row, nurses have topped the Gallup polls as the most honest and ethical profession by survey takers. Since nurses make up the largest part of the healthcare profession and are encountered most often by patients, they're commonly referred to as the face of healthcare. And that's why it's so important, that we remain trusted, because it's so necessary that we are because you're going to have to come across this at some point. You either have a chronic illness or you are ill in the moment, and nurses will be there. We are on 24/7 in about every setting that you can think of. So it's really important that we are trusted. So just kind of a glimpse of what the Gallup poll looks like. Here's the last 4 years and some other professions that are on the list. And really, you can see that a lot of them stay right about where they are. Nurses have been in the 80th percentile for quite a while. And, you know, there are several on here that have remained. But it's curious to me to think about, especially now in the world we live in, that nurses, police officers, members of Congress, with it being an election year, we are in, you know, these three professions, that's why I picked them, are in the media all the time. All the time. We're constantly looked to for questions. You know, it seems like it's becoming more prevalent, and it's probably not going to go away, that we are in the news every day. So nurses, I'm thinking, you know, of course, of my own, when I read a headline like the couple that I shared in the story, in the article, nurse charged in beating death of impaired woman. Voodoo using UK nurse sentenced for trafficking Nigerian women. I mean, what? That's terrible. All of these things are terrible. And if they were done on the job, then we do have to share that. People need to be warned. That's important. But these didn't happen on the job. So just if somebody reads that and then they become ill and they encounter a nurse, will it stop them from seeking care because they don't trust the person because of something that they read or something that was presented to them as they were bombarded with information? Same goes for police officers and members of Congress. A serial rapist cop's mistake, assaulting the grandmother who finally reported him. How do you recover from rapist cop? I mean, that's awful. Same thing, lawmakers kick the can down the road on discussing the most contentious issues of privacy legislation. You know, using words like absolutely frivolous, you know. This is how people are getting information. So if this is all they're reading and they don't make a decision for themselves, they leave with just seeing that and that's it. You know, where is the help in that? Where is the healthy democracy? You know, it would be hard pressed to not influence somebody with words like that. So then, of course, the solution, what really needs to stop is throwing the entire profession into the headline for an incident that had nothing to do with the profession at large. And what I shared in the article is the imperatives that are followed by journalists. Headlines must be correct. Headlines must connect to ordinary readers. Headlines must attract attention. And they must set a tone for the article. Those seem fair. They seem very good. You know, certainly, why not? But my challenge to journalists is to pause. After you write that headline, after you're following the imperatives you already know and love and use, but to pause and make sure that your headline is helping and not harming. You know, is it doing what you set out to do, which was maybe tell a story, but is it not doing something very harmful, for example, to an entire profession without meaning to do that? Because if it's innocent or malicious, at the end of the day, the message is still the same. It still happened. People are still gaining their information from just that, you know, slew of 30 words or less, you know, or whatever, you know. So I really challenge journalists to think about that and to add that into their normal scope, is to pause and just think about maybe, just maybe, the world would gain a healthier democracy if journalists also took an oath to help and not harm, like we do. So with that, I'll pass it back to Rich.
Rich, you have to unmute.
Oh, sorry, I didn't see. I had pinned myself, so let me unpin myself. There you go.
Okay. All right, I muted myself during Connie's presentation. So I will just repeat and say that I enjoyed the presentation. I thought it was a really good summary of the paper, having spent some time with the paper. And I just want to throw out a couple of thoughts before I turn it over to the panel. And not so much as a way of defense of what journalists do, but some explanations. And this may go back to maybe when Denny and I were journalists. There were a lot of mechanics and requirements involved with headlines. It wasn't as easy now where there were an infinite number of fonts. So you had to fit things certain ways. There were rules. The headlines had to break a certain way. And even though everything is online now, I think some of those, procedures and policies have remained in place. And the other thing I would just kind of think we should all be aware of is that the media, news organizations are businesses. They exist primarily to make profits. There's a few very good nonprofit organizations, but the bottom line is they need to bring people to their websites. They need to get people to watch their TV reports or read the newspapers. So some of that, I think, also factors just for a practical matter into headlines. But what I'd like to get your thoughts on is, you did a good job. You challenged journalists. I always throw it back at the public. I think we should challenge the public to do more than read the headlines. And as you said, it's tough these days with everything that bombards us. But you think part of the responsibility also lies on the public to read beyond the headline?
Oh, absolutely. I think that it's really important. I don't know if there's feedback. Do you hear feedback? I'm sorry.
No, you were breaking up a bit, but you sound fine now. So
okay, absolutely. I think that it's important that the general public knows what kind of news they're digesting and make an educated decision as adults as to what they're consuming and where they're getting their information. Absolutely, because it's everywhere. So they need to also have that understanding.
Okay, great. Well, let's kind of go through the panel. Pauline, I'll let you kick it off, and you need to unmute yourself. I'll warn you so you don't fall into the trap that I did.
Well, first of all, I'd like to say that my husband, the engineer, is going to be thrilled that he is more honest and ethical than I am, evidently. So I'll tell him. He'll be excited about that.
The Gallup poll is
I know, you can't argue with Gallup.
It's information you may or may not want to know.
I will say this though, I have worked in healthcare in public relations, and one of the roles as a PR practitioner is to try to encourage or try to, I don't know if I want to say teach, but you want to try to, teach the people that you're working with how to handle the media, what they should say, what they shouldn't say. And one of the things that's so difficult is actually separating your job from you as a person. And I don't know that we always do that, not even just in nursing. And certainly I realize why you're pointing that out because, according to the poll, honesty and ethics are important. We're all going to interact with nurses likely sometime. But I'm always Pauline Hoffmann professor. Richard Lee is Richard Lee professor. And often I'll see headlines that might say, not this one necessarily, Pauline Hoffmann professor, beat a small child. I mean, I did not do that. But would that be important? Is that something that we need to think about? Something else that, I often say too, and actually I think I saw Paul Whelan's name in the list of attendees. So I'll give him credit because he says this as well. If you don't want bad coverage, don't do stupid stuff. So there is some of that as well. Now, that doesn't mean we should denigrate an entire profession, but I think that it's important to think about the fact that I don't think you can ever truly separate yourself from what your job is. Even though you technically should be able to, I suppose. I shouldn't be professor all the time. At night when I'm not actually teaching, should I still be considered professor? And I think it's particularly difficult now too with social media because you're never off, unless you're in your living room, I guess, and you don't have friends over. So it becomes very difficult. So I'm gonna say that, and I will also. I just saw my notes on this. I think in healthcare particularly, and this is something that we struggled with from a PR perspective too, is you don't want people to make mistakes in healthcare. Like your doctor shouldn't make a mistake. Your nurse should never make a mistake. But guess what? You're just as human as the rest of us. And sometimes it happens. You don't want to make the mistake. Unfortunately, when you make mistakes, it could lead to death, which is, not an outcome anyone wants. But we have to be mindful of that too, that, this particular profession and health professions, love you for doing it, but you make mistakes as well. And then, should it follow you once you leave? You're right. I mean, so I'd be curious to hear what some of the journalists say. So I'll pause there, Rich. I'll mute myself so others can speak.
Okay. Connie, did you want to address anything Pauline said, or you just want to go through the panel?
Oh, I absolutely agree. It is very difficult to be anybody but a nurse. Just because you don't have scrubs on does not mean that they don't recognize you. Even now, I see patients that I had, and they remember, and I was nighttime for a long time. So it's funny to think that they even recognize me when it's light out and not in scrubs. So it's very hard.
Yeah, I mean, Pauline and I were talking about this earlier, that, it's not just journalists. I think we as a society tend to just label
Correct.
people by profession. So with that said, we'll go to the TV reporter, which is Charlie. What are your thoughts, Charlie?
Can everybody hear? It's kind of loud on my end. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, you sound fine to us.
Okay, because my air conditioner went out and the guy's here fixing it. So as long as you can hear me. Yeah, a few things. It was interesting, the whole Hippocratic Oath thing there about, doing no harm. I think that, in journalism, we're trying not to do harm, but we always, Dean Capola always used this in our classes about you have to maximize truth and minimize harm. So just because, a story may harm the image of a certain profession, on the other hand, you're getting information out there to the public that they, need to know about. I would say when journalists think of doing no harm, are they talking about a certain profession, or are they talking about the public at large? Because I would argue that we are here to serve the public at large. In the case of the police officer, I thought that the headline was great, and because he was indeed a serial racist, rapist rather, cop. This police officer, I did some research, was convicted of raping 13 African-American women in the back of his police car and in their homes, and he was sentenced to 263 years in prison. So I don't think there was any doubt as to whether he was indeed that. Now, the other question as to whether people are going to draw conclusions about an entire profession, I've encountered this in my reporting with Catholic priests, where I know a lot of Catholic priests, and every story that I think it's interesting there that I think if you ask people those numbers, clergy and police officers in particular, if you did that poll today, I think the numbers would be a little different with everything that's been in the news. But they would often say to me, the priests that I knew, well, you're just making us all look bad. And I would say to them, no, Father so-and-so is making you look bad. I think the sign of a profession is what I used to tell them. The sign of a profession is that it can regulate itself. And that if you're a good priest, you want all the bad priests to be out of that profession. If you're a good journalist, you want the Jason Blairs of the world to be exposed and driven out of that profession. I used to tell them the only reason the media and the courts are having to come in and regulate you is because you have not regulated yourself as a profession. So I think that in a sense we're doing a public good. Some of these are a little iffy. I mean, I can see why the voodoo headline, I can see why they used that because the prosecutors essentially, I think, wanted to tell a story about how they came in contact. And she did come in contact in a medical setting. I think that that's a headline where it's kind of like it could be a give or take. But practically speaking, as Rich said, I used to write headlines for a newspaper I worked for, and nurse is 5 characters, and Schenectady woman is, it's 18 characters. So that does enter into the equation, but I do think a distinction should probably be drawn, like you said, as to whether it's happening in the workplace or not.
Yeah. And I think Charlie makes a number of good points, but one I wanted to kind of pick up on is that some of it is the nature of our business. If you're a cop and you do something bad, it's news. If you're a nurse and you do something bad, it's news. If you come to work every day and you do your job ethically and honestly and efficiently, it's not news, unfortunately. And I think I'll go back to putting more onus on the public. That's not what the public wants to read. When you look at, now we have very sophisticated Google Analytics, we can see what people like to read. And unfortunately, it's not the good, happy, feel-good stories. Okay, I'm going to go to Denny unless, do you want to chime in, Connie, before we move on?
No, you're good. Well, appreciate that.
Okay. The floor is yours, Denny.
If journalists took an oath to help, they wouldn't be journalists. When I look at the title of the article we're discussing, it says headlines should help, and I disagree with that. Headlines should inform. That is the fundamental job of journalism. In fact, journalism was the nation's first teachers because we didn't have school systems until well into the 1800s. There's a number of points I'd like to make here. First, the notion of journalistic identity. When we write about people, our job is to make them absolutely unique so that they cannot be confused with any of the other 7+ billion people on the planet. And we use name, age, address, and occupation. So, as Pauline said, you are a part of your occupation. Now, let's take this example. There's a man arrested in downtown Allegheny, and he is charged with running a marijuana ring. Well, you've seen that news in Taft, you've seen it in the Olean Times Herald, but suppose the name of the man is Dennis DePero. He's a college president, and believe me, SBU president is going to be in the headline of that story, and it's going to be in the front page, because that person is an educator. So we have values that define news, and one of them, of course, is magnitude. And as Charlie points out, a police officer that rapes women 13, 15 times, that's magnitude, and that puts rapist cop in a headline. Now, when I was a cub reporter 51 years ago, I asked, because my degree was in geology, not journalism, I asked my newsroom godfather, so what is this journalism all about? And Neil just turned to me and said, defend your readers. So if I've got a nurse practitioner whose child dies in a hot car, well, part of that is an indictment of the thought process of a nurse practitioner at that point in time, not at work. But it's still a warning bell argument to present to the public. There's also the issue of some of the headlines that people read are headlines for opinion pieces rather than news pieces. And what really frustrates me, far more than it will frustrate Connie, is we now have young reporters, people with very little experience, writing headlines for their own stories and posting them because they want to get online before the next person does. And so the second set of eyes doesn't see them. And the second set of eyes says, no, Schenectady woman, not nurse.
Okay. I'm interested in Connie's response, but I just wanted to remind the folks that are online, if you want to ask a question, use the chat feature. I see we have two from Dr. Paula, but first, Connie, you want to unpack some of what Denny said?
Sure. I think that's the beauty of this type of project, is learning about what other disciplines do. Because certainly, some things were apparent with how many characters one thing is or the other. But it's really, from the lens of somebody in that profession. When you read something that happens to a peer, even if they're not your coworker, right? They still are part of your profession. You read that and you do stand to learn something. You stand to learn where they took a misstep, where they didn't follow their oath, whatever happened. Maybe you can learn from their mistakes. But if something happens outside of work, that's where it's really bothersome. Certainly, with some of the stories that you've shared, that it did make sense. They were in, and I did include that in my article, that there are times we have to consider that. But it's difficult to digest the knowledge, knowing that it could just be the headline and they move on. And I agree, as was already stated, the public needs to do their homework too. They can't just trust anything that they see, but it's becoming more and more difficult to filter that. You can get information from anywhere, and it can very well be misinformation. So I agree.
Anyone else on the panel have a question before we open it up to the audience?
One thing, I have done a little bit of reporting on the nursing profession through nursing homes, which always seems to be in the news. I do think it's important that, you look at how a profession is regulated. You brought up, the standing, that confidence that the public has in each profession. And I almost think you almost have an obligation to point out the profession if it's relevant, especially in the cases where there is a lot of trust. I can't tell you how many times people said to me, I said, well, why didn't you do something? Why didn't you call the police? Why didn't you tell your parents that this happened to you? And they said, well, the person was a priest. They're so trusted, they would never believe me. I did a story with a nurse in a nursing home where she found out that she had 9 felonies on her record, and that New York State does not require nurses to undergo background checks. They require all of the nursing aides to undergo it, but not RNs. And I got on the phone, and she wasn't happy about it. And she said, "You're going to ruin my life." This was a long time ago. I was young. And I certainly understand that. But the case I had made to her was, if that was your mother in that nursing home, wouldn't you want to know who you're dealing with? Wouldn't you want to know the background of who you're dealing with? And I feel like, in a certain sense, disagree with Denny a little bit in that I do think by pointing that out in a headline, the journalist is not trying to slander the profession. They're trying to do good and to help in a way by informing the public and warning them so that, don't trust everybody you meet. I mean, certainly, you hope that people won't become so cynical and never trust a nurse or a doctor or a journalist or anything, but you are informing them so that they themselves aren't perhaps as trusting of people in those traditional authority professions.
And I'd like to jump in and touch on something you had said earlier too, Charlie, and then, something you said, Connie. Charlie, when you mentioned, and now I just lost my train of thought completely. Isn't that terrible? It'll come back to me and I'll chime in. I completely lost it. Holy cow.
Okay, that happens to us all. Dr. Paula had 2 questions. Paula, I'm gonna see if I can unmute you because, rather than try to read your questions, but looks like I can't do that. Oh, here we go. No.
I am muting myself. Am I on?
Yeah, you're on now. I guess I could read your questions, but they're not on too long. But
Okay.
rather than me read them, why don't you go ahead and I know you had 2 questions, so start with the first
Connie,
one.
first of all, thank you, panelists. Thank you, Rich Lee and gang. Thank you very much for Tap Integrated Olean every day. That's my news. Anyways, Connie, do you think, in light of the pandemic, that the nursing profession has gotten the recognition and positive reporting because of the pandemic, and at the same time that not only are they sharing what happens on the job, but about personal health issues, post-traumatic stress syndrome, that a couple of the people in the nursing profession that ended up taking their own lives, but that it's being done in a positive way to show that this pandemic has affected people in so many ways, so that it's given you, the nursing profession frontline, a good publicity of what you've been doing for years, but now it's really in the front line. And then my second question, in light of a couple webinars I've been on recently of the biases within our profession. So in light of the protests for social reform, do you see in the nursing profession that the testing procedures and the licensing procedures are really biased, and the percentage of nurses of diversity or people in the field of diversity is low because the field has a history of biases that have been going on for years that we haven't really paid attention to. So those are my two questions.
Sure. So I'll start with your first one with COVID-19 and nurses being in the news. I certainly feel like we have been in the spotlight more now than ever. And there's been good and bad. Certainly, we are becoming, this year was supposed to be the year of the nurse and midwife. ANA started that in January. We had been planning on it 2020. So this year was supposed to be our year to increase the number of registered nurses that sit on boards that have voting authority. We were planning several seminars and just increasing our resiliency to mental health, taking the time we need to bring that to light because we have mental health concerns as well. So if anything, COVID-19 has made that all come forward without us having the time to be able to end those, self-help and, meditation sessions and all that, although they're happening. But what I'm finding is that the attendance is great, and others, they didn't turn out as well because they're all of us are working more or working in different lights. So I do like to see that nurses are in the spotlight, and I think that the more as was said for a story, when nurses are out saying we need more PPE, this occurrence happened, they're working with their unions to get more PPE, they were advocating with our legislators, to do so and so on, that it's a positive thing because it's really showing the public all the kinds of things that we did. When I was the negotiation chair for our union at Cole, I did a lot of things that no one would ever know. Because it was, working for the greater good in our area. But then I was also networking with people at larger hospitals, magnet facilities. How do you do it? How do you advocate to make sure that you aren't doing as much mandatory overtime without sacrificing your patient's care, and making sure that you have the spots covered? Certainly when I was a nursing supervisor, that was our biggest problem, was making sure that the holes were filled, that nobody was mandated to stay. That was always our goal. But it happened, sometimes. There were plenty of times where, my shift ended at 7, my husband's 7 p.m. and my husband's shift started at 7 p.m. and I was in an ambulance at 8 or 9 o'clock at night because a patient needed an RN to go somewhere else. And because I was a supervisor, I was on a salary. So it wasn't mandatory overtime for me. I was just able to go. So it's definitely important that we're in the media, and given this time, we're able to share with the public what we're doing. I think most of what I've seen is positive, although sometimes, it seems like when we protest, when we say these things, I also hear the backlash of just do your job. Without COVID-19. I think a lot of the general public realize that that our occupation is relatively dangerous given these things that happen. But we live through them and we learn through them. So I hope that answers kind of the first part of your question is, yes, we're out there, and we are in the media, but I do think that it can be looked at as positive because now people are seeing us for who we are. And then the second part of your question, I think if I understand it right, Sister Paula, was testing and licensing, not having representative, diverse workforce. And is your information or your assumption part of not having underrepresented cultures in becoming nurses?
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. So it goes back a long ways on that. Nursing is pre-licensure is very rigorous, and we have to do a lot in a short period of time. Certainly generations to come are not looking for a longer opportunity to be in college. They want it to be faster, quicker, more efficient, get out with less loans and more certifications and all these great, grand, wonderful things. But the problem with it being faster is you need to be faster and you need to come over prepared. You need to have those opportunities that are often not given to those on a low socioeconomic, those of a low socioeconomic background, like taking extra college classes, getting the right prep course for your SATs, all sorts of things. Having to have a car to get to clinicals because the clinical site is an hour away and the college can't provide you that. Things like that. Certainly most colleges will charge a lab fee. You'll have a technology fee. You'll have, it's a very expensive profession to get into. And there has been quite a bit of work on starting earlier to prepare for that. I've read quite a few articles on going into high school, especially those that have the lower socioeconomic background families and underrepresented groups, to start that foundation earlier. Be an influence in their life, because they might not have a nurse in their family. They might not have someone who went to college in their family, and open the gates that they need to, and help them understand what's needed to happen. So I think that there's a lot of work to do, but we've been making some strides in that by really talking about it and putting it out there. Certainly at any level, wanting to infuse culture into a program is very important, and it's growing, and I hope to see it continue.
Okay, thanks. I want to throw it back to Denny for a second, and then back to Pauline, because I know Pauline's thought came back to her. But Denny, on the first question, I wonder if you could just maybe underscore a bit, what journalism is about. I think sometimes there's a misconception that we're in the business to glorify people, and not to say that we don't appreciate the things that nurses and frontline workers have done, but it's not our job to write stories to thank them. That's other people.
When I teach one of my reporting courses, the hardest thing I try to get when students are trying to think up stories is to have no assumptions, that they should let the story begin to develop and just keep asking people questions over and over. If they think they need to know how the story's going to end before they actually begin working on the story, they're going to come up with a really lousy story. So the first tenet of good journalistic practice is make no assumptions. Test everything people tell you.
Charlie, do you want to add anything to that before we switch to Pauline?
No.
Okay. Okay, Pauline.
Pauline Hoffmann, professor,
Yeah.
can't remember anything. That's the headline tonight. Charlie, one thing you had mentioned when you were talking about the work that you've been doing on the Catholic priest situation is, the one who had said to you, you're making us all look bad. And I'm reminded of that because and you're right. No, I'm not making you look bad. The people who are doing this are making you look bad. So we do have to remember that, hearing about one nurse in the paper is probably not going to make people think that the whole profession is bad. People, as the public, Rich is, and as have others have pointed out, the public needs to be able to discern that and to discern, okay, is it this profession that I should be worried about, or is it just this one rogue person? So I just wanted to kind of bring that back up, that, we're not here making anybody look bad. I'm in PR not trying to save your reputation. I mean, certainly that's part of the job, but I'm still trying to be truthful, and I want to be honest and represent things in an appropriate way. And journalists are here to inform and to tell the truth too.
If I may piggyback on that, Rich,
Right.
A lot of what I'm listening to is what I heard 50 years ago when I first got into the newsroom. People would be telling me, how come you don't print any good news? Well, that's not our job. It's not our job to print good news, bad news. It's our job to portray what we see in life, good or bad, and let readers assess what it should mean to them. Of course, in the world of blogging, that doesn't matter anymore. In the world of Instagram and Facebook, but those are journalists.
I do think, Denny, that at its core, a hard news reporter, something like that I'm doing every day, yes, that's true. But I am finding, just an observation, I am finding more of my bosses, and I don't think it's just in TV, I think it's in newspapers too, there is an appetite for, a nice feature story about frontline workers like nurses nowadays, because people do occasionally want to, you know, that to be highlighted, and they do want to hear about that. Another, but you mentioned about journalism students, you know, wanting the story to be written before they even start reporting it. It's not just students. It's my bosses do that all the time. Decided what the story is, and I said, let's get out and start reporting before we what we think it's going to be. You know, another thing though, I think this is such an important topic, Dr. Perkins, and I'm so happy that you picked it, because the couple of years I spent working at the Buffalo News, the #1 complaint from anybody always was headlines. And one of the things that people could never get their head around was that reporters on newspapers don't write the headlines for their own stories. At least they didn't used to. In my job now, I actually do write the headline on my web story, which is a little different, and I think I'm more sensitive to it because of that. But I would write my story, send it in, and then there'd be somebody on the copy desk, at 10 o'clock at night, totally dispassionate, disconnected from the story, who is essentially summing it up. And I'd come in the morning, and my sources would say, "Great article. I hated the headline. Why did you do that?" And I'd have to explain to them this whole process that never really made a lot of sense. It had to do with schedules and that sort of thing. But you're right. There are so many people who comment on our stories on an everyday basis, and it drives me nuts. And they comment on it, and you can tell from what they say in the comment that they have not read the story.
Yeah.
What I also want to jump into from a PR perspective, I always love it when I would have clients who would come to me and say, "I want to be on the front page of the news." And I'd say, "I really don't want you there. Have you ever read the front page of a newspaper? That would make my life hell. Please, can we not get there?" So I don't care your profession. Like, please don't go.
I don't know if you guys can see the comments, but there's one from our friend Paul Wheeland, who kind of is in line with some of what the journalists are saying. As a veteran of journalism for 6 decades, I wonder why we would ever become PR people for nurses or for any other profession, which,
classic Wheeland, Wheeland.
And Mike, let me see if you want to ask your question, I can unmute you or I can read it. It's up to you. Give him a second.
Yeah, I'll read it because it's got typos in it. If you read it.
Yeah, I think I figured out what they were, but I'll let you go with it.
Connie, it's good to see you. It's been too long.
Yes.
My first comment is, you saw where advertising professionals ranked on that list of professions, so I feel like Rodney Dangerfield when I ask that or make this comment. Connie, it seems to me that the very oath you cite carries within it the explanation of the headlines you cited. The nurse practitioner who left the child in the car did harm.
Mm-hmm.
The nurse who beat the disabled patient did harm. That is what made the news newsworthy. It wasn't any attempt to demean the profession. It was to point out that these people had, in point of fact, violated the very oath of the profession that people honor. You can mute me now.
Yeah. And yeah, I absolutely agree. They did harm. And that's where, the magnitude that was shared tonight, that's why it got so much press. That's why it stuck out to me even, these things. But, my point, I suppose, is to really point out, to just take that pause to say, is it necessary to point out that they're doing this profession, that this profession had done this outside of work? There are several areas that, yes, the incident happened at work. Yes, we stand to gain knowledge from it, gain a warning, and know that harm is there. So that is a helpful headline. But when they aren't on the job, when it is something that's happening, that they were just a normal person, I suppose, and made a mistake, that's the difference that I urge. And I certainly would not urge journalists to change everything they're doing, because 100% we need the information, and we need good information, and we need it to be informative. And if the information shows us that something bad has happened, we need to know that too. But when it is not helpful overall because the occupation has nothing to do with it, then that is where it would be a difference, in my opinion, that the oath is there, that just take that pause, take a pause. Is this necessary? And certainly, as Charlie just shared, I had no idea that somebody else would be writing that headline. That seems foreign to me, so that's information that would be new and interesting to learn in this interdisciplinary project.
Yeah, that's, go ahead, Denny.
You said take a pause. Let me try to suggest why it's so difficult to take a pause now. Is about 10, 12 years ago, we had 1,420 daily newspapers in the United States. And we had about 56,000 journalists, reporters and editors in newsroom. That number is now under 30,000. Yet the people who run those newspapers, who get the big salaries, they expect the same productivity. So a reporter like Charlie, poor guy, might spend 8 hours talking to 15 sources to do a story, and all of a sudden he's in a predicament where he's got to do 8 stories in that time, and he'll end up talking with one source. And before he has the time to think about the headline he just wrote, he'll go on. And I saw a statistic today, when you look at weeklies and dailies, we've lost 300 newspapers in the last 6 years.
Wow.
So we are an imperfect profession, but man, the ads are stacked against us so badly. And the pressure on people to produce copy, which is poorly written, underreported, forget the headlines. It's difficult. And because of this, the journalism industry, not journalists, the journalism industry is not serving its readers well.
Yeah, and I would go back to Mike's point that, the fact that these individuals were nurses who committed these crimes, made it maybe perhaps more newsworthy. And it's similar to what Denny said before. If there's a traffic accident or DWI, it's not that big a story. But if the person involved is the college president, then it suddenly becomes a bigger story.
Right.
I want to go to Steve, who's posted a couple of interesting comments. So, Steve, if you're there, I can unmute you, and you can
all right.
make your comments, ask your questions much better than I can just by reading them.
Thank you, Rich. The point I wanted to make was that everyone is judged by or is ultimately judged by what they do. The garbage man, the waitress, the delivery person, and that each of us should try to live up to our title. And so in the case of the MP, she should be judged as a person, not as someone who is a nurse. So the questions I'm sure the story or the reporter asked were, did she work too many hours? Was she stressed by working in a bad or poorly run institution? She should not have been identified and judged as an NP. Journalists do have some responsibility to not only write good stories, but as we learned last week, they should also write truthful and factual headlines. So this is where I think journalists need to be held accountable, as Connie has mentioned too, that in the story of the nurse practitioner, it should not have been that she was a nurse practitioner who did this. She was a person who made a bad judgment. She happened to be a nurse practitioner. So I have 2 questions. One for Connie, first of all. Connie, in your curriculum that you're going to be teaching these professionals or people who want to become this profession, is part of that curriculum going to be the development of people to understand that the job that they're training for is also who they are going to be?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
What we have right now is a post-licensure. So all of our students have their license already. They're registered nurses coming back to get their bachelor's. That's what's open now. But we absolutely included in that. We have a full leadership course where we talk about how to present ourselves. And actually our department mission and our organizing framework is seated in emotional intelligence for those very reasons. Because I don't think everybody who gets into a profession like nursing realizes that I'm not being unrealistic, that you can't have a presence elsewhere or identify yourself as something else than a nurse. But in the norm in America, you are known as a nurse. And certainly there's been a lot of debates even of wearing your uniform outside of work. Commenting, when you go through a hospital orientation, they often talk about what you should and shouldn't say if you're ever interviewed and what the consequences of those are. I've highlighted stories in my past when I was teaching at the associate level. I included in one of my lectures a story of a nurse who was fired because of her Halloween costume. She wasn't dressed as a nurse. She happened to post it on social media, and it was questionable. We'll put it that way.
Right.
And she chose to be terminated.
I think the three of us who are journalists just saw a good story idea there. So.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And now I'd like to turn it to the journalists, especially to the journalism faculty members here. Do you talk to your students about what it means to be a journalist and their responsibilities to tell the truth, to write the truth, to look for the truth? How much do you put into your classes telling journalists that they're going to be judged as a journalist? So they darn well better be a good journalist.
Charlie, I think you better take that one.
Oh, okay. Well, good. Charlie, as a former student and as a successful reporter, do you feel that you got that?
Yeah, I really felt that, because of the faculty members here, on this call and many others, that we were always taught that there's a high standard because you are in a position of public trust. And we were always taught that, even when you go home, you shouldn't be doing certain things. You shouldn't be putting lawn signs for politics on your front yard. You shouldn't be having bumper stickers be on your bumper. You should.
My guests pointed out to remind us that we are in freshman orientation right now. And this year, several of our faculty put together a packet of information. A lot of it was about writing, but a lot of it was about honesty, loyalty, screed against plagiarism, to tell them, listen, you're just not coming to college. You're coming to the Jandoli School where the expectations are high. The dean did a video introduction. Several of the faculty spoke in it. So let's put it this way. We've already fired the shot across their bow about what it means to set ourselves apart from everybody else.
I would say it's not just something that we put into our classes and instructions, it's who we are. And I think that comes across with the students. And I know in my classes, even if it's a news writing class, I spend a considerable amount of time talking about what's going on in the industry. And we look at why people are criticizing journalists. So we look at maybe what journalists are doing that is good, that's not so good, so that, they don't learn how to be reporters in a vacuum. They learn about the industry as well.
I think that,
Okay.
about the medical profession and journalism that we have in common here is that the most harmful mistakes happen through carelessness. I mean, it's getting the infection in the operating room by not cleaning off the tools. It's, writing 95% of the story well, and then you're about to walk out of the office and you don't check that extra fact. I think that what Connie brings up as far as knowing, especially as a young journalist, that what you write actually has an effect on people's lives, that they are not just, a line in a story. I think that always makes you a better journalist because, you treat people like human beings. And I always tell young reporters when they're asking me how to, talk to people in sensitive situations, you have to be a human being first and a good human being before anyone will trust you as a journalist.
Paul Wheeling
thank
has
you.
asked
Thank
if he
you.
can talk, and I'm sure we all want to hear from Paul. So, Paul, think you have to unmute yourself, Paul. There you go.
Yes. Hi, Paul. Howdy.
Senator.
I am Senator. Yes, yes, indeed. I have. I think this is partly a cultural issue, and I think all journalism reflects the culture of the society in which it's undertaken. For example, if you saw a head in the paper or on a website that said paleontologist leaves child in a hot car, it would be, they wouldn't use the term paleontologist. No way. But the fact that the nursing profession and is so highly rated, and the law enforcement profession, cops, are so highly rated or more highly rated, reflects on the fact that we give those professions or occupations a high cultural value, that they help us live, they help us maintain sanity in our communities. So when someone who has that identification on their vita or in their professional resume is arrested or is charged or is some other way scandalous in the media, they are identified by the fact of what they do and who they are. It's not because it's an attack on them. It's a reflection on the fact that, oh my God, a nurse did this. That hardly ever happens. Or a cop beat up on someone in the George Floyd. Well, it happens more with cops, but nonetheless, it's still an aberration. These are aberrant occasions, and therefore they're going to be reflected in the journalism because they are aberrant. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. We're past our first hour, so I mean, it's been a great discussion. I don't want to keep everyone too long. I see one more question from Louis, who I don't think is on the session anymore, but interesting thing, is it true that you should sometimes keep a profession out of a headline, not to make it hurt? I don't recall that ever happening. I don't know, Charlie, Denny, I think you just got to call it as it is.
Yeah.
Yeah, it happened. It happened all the time with Catholic priests in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. I can't tell you how many times I talked to cops who said, yeah, we just picked them up and let them go because, they're priests and we didn't want people to lose faith from that.
Pauline, did you want to say something?
I think that's
Okay, I just want to, before we go, ask Connie, was this enlightening for you? I know you made the comment about, reporters not writing headlines, which is something we all take for granted. And, as Charlie said, he experienced, and I think we've all experienced, we've all had situations where people have been upset with a headline and they have no idea that as a reporter you didn't write it. But beyond that, do you feel like you gained more of an understanding of what we do as journalists?
Yeah, absolutely. Just from thinking about how to write anything and what's important and what's necessary was enlightening alone, let alone this panel discussion and opportunity for Q&A from those in the industry and those our best, faculty. So I appreciate that, the opportunity to share and to hear from another discipline that I may not encounter if I wasn't at Bonaventure.
Right, and yeah, you did share a building with us, so by osmosis,
That's
maybe.
true.
That's right. Mike wanted to say something before we left, so Mike, I think you can. You're unmuted now.
Okay, I just want to say, make one more comment. I really think Connie's onto something here. I think we should remind ourselves, whatever we write a story or a headline, or for that matter, an ad, that we should do no harm. That doesn't mean somebody's not going to get hurt by a headline, but it should mean that the headline was written to do good.
Okay, well, I think those are good words to end by. So I wanted to thank, all of our questioners. We had some great questions from the audience. Thank all the panelists, Pauline, Charlie, Denny, for spending some time on a hot, steamy night in July when we, could be someplace. And Connie, thanks for kind of getting the ball rolling, with your paper.
And
for
Connie, if you and your faculty want to pursue this, I'd be glad to come over for a socially distanced lunch.
Yes, well, we'll take you up on it.
Okay.
Okay, great. And we're gonna, the Giandoli Institute's gonna continue this series. Next week, we have a paper written by Phil Payne, our history department chair, who talks about the 1920 election, which took place right after the flu pandemic, and then comparing it to the 2020 election. Now he's going to look at the strategies that were employed in 1920, what might work, what might not work. So that'll be next week's discussion. We'll have the paper posted on Tuesday, and we'll follow up with a discussion on Thursday. But all the papers are on the website, jendoli.net. Once again, I'm Rich Lee, Executive Director of the Jendoli Institute. And again, I want to thank Connie and the panelists and our audience. Have a good night, everybody.
Goodbye, Charlie. See you.